Before we begin our journey on this peaceful night, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always delightful to discover where our listeners rest their heads as they travel with us through these old memories. The perfume of the Four Thieves, the fragrance that promised protection from the Black Plague. I remember a spring that arrived far too early, in a year when the church bells seemed to ring more often than the birds sang. At the time, I was living in Toulouse, still very young, on the upper floor of my Uncle Gerald's apothecary, a gentle-voiced man whose hands were always stained with tinctures and oils. Our days began before the sun, and ended by the glow of candles, scented with lavender and beeswax. The house exhaled a sweet, earthy aroma, a mix of vinegar, pine resin, and clove sachets hanging from the windows, which he believed protected us from the sickly air drifting through the streets. It was there, among amber bottles and rolls of cloth embroidered with the names of herbs, that I first heard the story of the Four Thieves. It was told by an old woman draped in linen veils, her eyes like dry walnut shells. She arrived quietly on a thick, foggy morning, claiming she sought protection against the invisible touch. As she rummaged through the jars on the shelf, she told us of 4 men in Marseille who could walk among the dead without falling ill. And why didn't they get sick? I asked. She smiled sideways, brushing her fingers against a dark glass bottle. Because they knew how to deceive the air itself with a scent stronger than fear. My uncle, always skeptical of enchanted tales, did not laugh or dismiss her. He simply nodded, like someone recognizing an old secret. Later that same damp afternoon, as he crushed lavender petals with the stone base of the mortar, he began to speak, as if the old woman's story had awakened some sleeping spark within him. "They say it was vinegar," he murmured, "but not just any vinegar. It was enriched with all that purifies the soul and confounds the air: rosemary, sage, cinnamon, cloves, wormwood, and lemon peel." He poured the mixture onto a cloth and tied it around his neck, like a kind of aromatic amulet. The scent was strong and clean, as if an entire forest had been distilled inside that bottle. In those days, Toulouse lived in a state of constant alarm. Processions had turned silent. The markets were deserted. Doors were marked with charcoal, and many prayed out loud just to hear themselves alive. But in our apothecary, the vinegar of the Four Thieves began to be prepared with almost ritual devotion. My fingers turned yellow from the saffron, and my clothes always carried a lingering, spicy scent. People came from far away, not just out of faith in the remedy, but seeking hope in liquid form. Some cried when they smelled the perfume, as if it carried the memory of a childhood without fear, or a mother who once embroidered lavender-scented handkerchiefs to ward off bad dreams. I particularly remember a young woman, Jean, who came from Albi, her eyes reddened by the wind and sorrow. She had lost 2 brothers in the same week and carried with her a silver reliquary and a nearly spent candle. She asked my uncle not for a cure, but for a fragrance that would allow her to sleep. We remained in silence for a moment as he prepared a new bottle. He added rose petals and a drop of honey to the vinegar. "To sweeten the memory," he said. Jean inhaled deeply, and as she opened her eyes, smiled like someone who, if only for a moment, had forgotten the pain. She left with the bottle clutched tightly to her chest, as if holding on to one last thread of human presence. It was during that time that we began to hear increasingly extraordinary stories about the thieves. Some said they wore gloves soaked in the mixture and cloths tied like masks, resembling birds with long beaks and dark feathers, perhaps the precursors to the plague doctors. Others swore the men had never been caught and still wandered the cities, no longer to steal, but to leave small bottles on windowsills, angels disguised as outlaws. Even my uncle, so devoted to the logic of remedies and tinctures, seemed gradually to yield to the idea that there was something mystical in that combination of vinegar and herbs. Something that touched not just the body, but the spirit of survival itself. On a particularly cold night, when the wind howled through the cracks in the windows and the fireplace crackled with elderwood branches, I awoke to the sound of soft footsteps on the stairs. I came down wrapped in blankets and found my uncle at the wooden counter, lamplit, eyes distant. He was testing a new variation of the perfume, now with lemon thyme and fresh bay leaves. "Fear," he said without looking at me, "spreads through the air like a rumor, but the right scent can intoxicate terror and lull it back to sleep." We sat there in silence for long minutes. Outside, the world seemed sick and far away, and inside the apothecary, a nearly sacred aroma lingered, a blend of healing and solace. As the months passed, the vinegar of the Four Thieves became more than just a recipe. It became a ritual. Before going out to deliver bottles or assist in nearby homes, we would soak cloths in the mixture and fasten them to our wrists and necks. Children came asking us to spray their clothes, and even the priests would bless the bottles before handing them to the faithful. There was a quiet comfort in that gesture, as if, by wearing the perfume, we were saying to one another, "We are still here. We still breathe." And even if science could not explain its effectiveness, something in those aromas soothed the soul, like the scent of a grandmother's embrace or fresh bread from the oven. Over time, I realized it wasn't the perfume itself that healed us, but what it reminded us of. Each herb told a story, each spice evoked a memory. The lavender of childhood linens, the rosemary of Sunday bread, the clove from wedding feasts. Amid the invisible horror of plague, the vinegar of the Four Thieves gave us back a sense of familiarity, as if whispering, "There is still beauty in the world." And perhaps that was what truly kept us strong, not the promise of immunity, but the restoration of something pure, fragrant, and untouched by death. One afternoon, years later, I saw Jeanne again in a village to the south. She wore a blue ribbon in her hair and carried a small basket of dried herbs. She recognized me instantly, and with a smile pulled a worn little bottle from her pocket. "I still use it when fear begins to creep back," she said, pressing it between her fingers. We sat beneath the shade of an olive tree, exchanging memories like old recipes. The perfume, now aged, still held something sweet and spicy, as if time had dared not touch its essence. And there, among quiet laughter and long silences, I realized that some cures are not meant to be drunk or rubbed on the chest, only shared. After that encounter, I began to keep a bottle with me always, not from fear of disease, which had retreated into the pages of chronicles, but from longing for those days when we believed a handful of herbs could protect the soul. The bottle rested beside my letters and rosaries, among those objects we do not lend or explain. And now and then, when the weight of the world pressed on my shoulders, I would uncap the bottle and let its aroma carry me back to my uncle's apothecary, to nights smelling of firewood, to the sound of whispered stories between the shelves. Today, as I write these memories by the soft light of a flickering candle, I understand that the vinegar was less a shield against death and more a gesture of tenderness among the living. It was a way to say, "I care, I see you," even when the face of the other was hidden behind masks and veils. And perhaps the Four Thieves, real or not, left us a legacy more precious than stolen gold. The reminder that, even in dark times, it is possible to scent life with hope, one drop at a time. Over the years, I heard many versions of who those thieves were. Some said they were disguised healers, others rogue monks. Some swore they were brothers raised by a blind midwife who knew all the secrets of herbs. But in the end, that mattered little. What remained was the gesture, to prepare, to share, to believe. In every bottle of vinegar, there was a small rebellion against despair, a perfumed way to say that the world still held space for care and wonder. And so I take my leave on this calm night, with a heart as light as dry leaves in the wind, and my spirit wrapped in the ancient scent of lavender, clove, and memory. May the perfume of these recollections lull you to sleep, dear traveler of time. And wherever your head may rest tonight, may fear find peace, and sleep, sweet company. The seamstress of white sheets, weaving beauty in times of the Black Death. I remember the hill of San Silvestro, where the cypress trees stood like silent sentinels, and the bells of the small chapel chimed in the wind with a melancholy almost maternal. It was a time of heavy silence, as if even the birds had forgotten their songs. The plague had arrived in Tuscany with velvet feet and a shadowed breath, leaving behind closed doors, empty streets, and black veils fluttering in the windows. Fear lingered at every corner, and many fled, carrying only what they could, or leaving everything, even their dead, behind. But there, among the scent of dried lavender and the rhythmic sound of a needle piercing linen, lived a woman who seemed to stitch resistance with her very fingers. Her name was Isabetta, and people spoke of her in the hushed tones reserved for healers or souls already halfway to heaven. Widowed many winters ago, she lived alone in a narrow atelier with tall windows and lace curtains embroidered with ivy and pomegranates. The floor was cold stone, but the warmth of the fire and the constant aroma of chamomile tea turned the space into a nest. Inside, even with the world crumbling beyond, there was a stillness that defied time. Isabetta did not lock her doors or hang crosses made of twigs over the windows. Instead, she prepared her white threads and began to embroider, not dresses, not bridal veils, but sheets. White sheets like freshly spilled milk, meant to cover those whom no one else dared to touch. They said each stitch she made was a silent prayer, a final act of dignity for the bodies left at street corners. Isabetta stitched names when she knew them, flowers when she did not, and small prayers sewn in blue thread, like whispered words woven by hand. There was never haste in her movements. She sat by the window, where the soft morning light filtered through cracked stained glass, and let the distant bells lull her. And when the bells fell silent, as they often did, she simply kept on stitching, as if understanding that some tasks must never stop, even when the whole world does. At first, people watched her with suspicion. Some said she was mad, others a saint. Some would pass by just to glimpse through the curtain slit the thin figure with hair tied in a simple bun, stitching in complete silence. I remember clearly one day when a child left a sprig of wildflowers on her doorstep, and Isabetta, without a word, pinned it to the corner of one of the sheets. It became a habit, small sprigs, petals, ribbons, left as offerings, or perhaps as thanks. Because somehow her sheets weren't just cloth, they were gestures. Gestures that touched even those who could no longer feel. Over time, Isabetta's sheets began appearing everywhere, covering bodies in shadowed alleys, draped on stone benches, wrapped around the shoulders of those burying loved ones. And strangely, there was beauty in them that defied grief. The embroidered flowers seemed plucked from gardens long vanished. The names, though stitched with trembling letters, seemed to restore a breath of identity to those whom death had made anonymous. Some even said the dead rested more peacefully beneath Isabetta's linen, and while that was only folk belief, no one dared deny it. One morning, while the fog still hugged the rooftops and the scent of fresh bread drifted softly from the slumbering bakery, a friar knocked on her door. In his arms was a small boy wrapped in a faded wool blanket. "He passed in the night," he murmured, eyes downcast. Isabetta did not speak. She simply stood, chose a sheet already finished, white with olive branches at the edges, and spread it gently over the child, as one might cover a sleeping son. Then, without a word, she returned to her loom. The friar stood motionless for a moment, unable to move. And then, before leaving, he made the sign of the cross and left a single coin on the table, not as payment, but as a promise of remembrance. As the months dragged on and church bells rang less and less, Isabetta's presence became almost legendary. In empty markets and deserted squares, people spoke of her as one might speak of a kind ghost, a soul protected by something others could not see. Some claimed she drank an old tonic made from rue and vinegar. Others swore they'd seen her speaking with a hooded figure one night, and that since then the illness dared not cross her threshold. But those who truly knew her, or thought they did, believed something simpler. Isabetta was protected by compassion itself, and in times as dark as those, perhaps that was enough. One afternoon, as warmth began to melt the fog and jasmine bloomed once more on courtyard walls, a woman dressed in black knocked at her door. She carried no body, asked for no sheet. She simply held a small box of dark wood. "It belonged to my sister," she said, offering it with trembling hands. Isabetta opened it carefully. Inside were old needles, bits of lace, and a silver thimble worn from use. "She was a seamstress too," the visitor murmured, holding back tears. Isabetta smiled gently, like someone recognizing an old mirror. She took the box in silence, and that same night used one of the needles to stitch a golden thread rose into the corner of a new sheet. It was her way of saying, "Memory remains." There was something profoundly serene in the way Isabetta lived between grief and grace. Her hands, though aged, moved with the lightness of someone who had stitched enough to know where each thread wishes to rest. It was said she whispered softly as she embroidered, not to the living but to the ones who had gone. "Here is your flower," she would murmur, "and here your mother's prayer." No one else heard those words, but anyone who entered her atelier swore they felt a presence, as if each stitched sheet truly carried a goodbye spoken with tenderness. One night, when the moon looked like white wax and dry branches drew long shadows on the village walls, a young man appeared at her door. His eyes were sunken, his shoulders slumped with the weight of loss. "My grandmother," he whispered, and needed say no more. Isabetta welcomed him in, offered him linden tea, and showed him a sheet she had just finished. It was simple, with bay leaves embroidered at the edges and a small blue star in the center. "She liked the sky, didn't she?" she asked. The young man, surprised, only nodded. It was as if Isabetta knew, as if she could feel what each soul deserved to carry, even in the end. That night he sat in silence as Isabetta completed the final stitches by the flicker of lamplight. Time moved differently there, slower, more human. Outside, wind swept through narrow streets, but inside the atelier there was only the comforting sound of needle through fabric, the clink of cooling tea in a clay cup, and a peace that draped over the shoulders like an invisible shawl. When at last he left, he carried not only the sheet, but something more subtle, a memory, perhaps, that love could still be woven even amid plague. The days passed, and the plague, little by little, began to retreat. Life, with its stubborn charm, peeked again through the cracks of windows. Children played once more in the streets, bells rang again in celebration, and forgotten gardens bloomed with red tomatoes and rosemary sprigs. Many left offerings at Isabetta's door, braided bread, dried figs, notes with poems, but she never stepped out to collect them. Each morning, the door was already ajar, as if the wind itself carried those tokens of gratitude inside. And the sheets were still being stitched, now with less urgency, but with the same care, as if beauty had learned there to exist even in the face of pain. Some began visiting the atelier, not for mourning, but out of reverence and curiosity. They saw Isabetta as a living reliquary of a time when compassion was resistance. Children sat on low stools to hear her stories as she stitched, and younger women asked to learn her embroidery, the tilted rose, the quiet cross, the leaf that danced in the wind. And she taught them, always with patience, as if offering more than technique, a way of seeing the world. "Each stitch must breathe," she said, "or the soul won't rest." One evening, as the sky began to turn gold, A young apprentice, Amalia, with unsteady hands and bright eyes, asked why Isabetta had never fallen ill, even surrounded by death. The seamstress rested the needle on her lap, looked out the window and said quietly, "Perhaps because I was never afraid, or perhaps because I was never alone." The answer was not precise, but carried the weight of things that are true. Amalia asked no more. She simply watched in silence as the setting sun spilled over the white linen, making each stitch shine as if sewn with threads of dawn. In time, Isabetta embroidered less and less, not from weakness, but because her days filled with other gentle tasks, gathering herbs, teaching children to brew teas, tending to kittens that mysteriously appeared at her doorstep. She smiled more, and though her eyes had dimmed a little, they still held that serene gleam of one who knows the worth of silence. The atelier, once a sanctuary of farewells, became a haven of quiet learning and soft laughter. The once bare walls now held framed flowers stitched on cloth, and the scent of lavender and old wood embraced each visitor like a warm welcome. It was on a mild spring afternoon, as the wind stirred the lace curtains and the chapel bells rang, as if in celebration of life itself, that Isabetta gently fell asleep in her favorite chair, the same one where she had so often stitched in silence. Her fingers still held a blue thread, unfinished, forming half of a star in the corner of a white sheet. Amalia found her there, head resting on her shoulder, with a smile as soft as the touch of newly sewn embroidery. There was no sorrow, only a gentle certainty that she had departed as she had lived, serene among flowers, threads, and memory. The next day, there was no funeral, no procession. The entire village knew no ritual could hold the measure of love that woman had stitched. Instead, Amalia hung every finished sheet, dozens of them, across the courtyard lines, where they swayed in the wind like flags of silent peace. Each carried flowers, names, prayers, and a small blue stitch in the bottom corner, the quiet signature of the seamstress who had turned mourning into tenderness. For hours, the villagers walked among the sheets like sacred gardens, touching with reverent fingers the stories that still lived in the cloth. They say that night, beneath a generous moon and a sky speckled with stars, the wind whispered between the sheets as if carrying ancient voices. And though Isabetta was no longer there to stitch, some swore they still felt her presence whenever a stitch was made with care, whenever someone tended to another without expecting anything in return. The plague had gone, but what it left, fear, scars, silence, was slowly being covered by new sheets, now embroidered by many hands. And so, between memory and thread, the village learned that not every farewell must be bitter, and that sometimes beauty is the sweetest remedy against death. The boy of the images, drawing the Black Plague with charcoal and clay. I remember a long, very long winter in the damp hills surrounding Prague. Rooftops wept icicles as if mourning in silence, and the convent's stone slabs cracked under the weight of snow, like old bones stretching. There, among soft-stepping monks and unhurried manuscripts, lived a boy with enormous eyes and no voice. His name was Yannick. He was as small as a dandelion puff before the wind, and his hair bore the dull color of dried clay. He didn't speak a single word, no laughter, no cries, no songs, only silence and fingers stained with charcoal. No one knew exactly where he came from. They said he'd been left at the convent's doorstep during the second full moon of that year, wrapped in a grey cloth with a copper coin pressed into his palm. Perhaps a payment, perhaps a blessing. We accepted him, as one accepts a wary cat on stormy nights, without demanding answers. Yannick grew up among cold stones and Latin chants, always apart but never rejected. His refuge was the abandoned cloister in the back, where the old, forgotten walls would soon become his way of speaking to the world. It was there, among moss and cracks, that his first drawings began to appear. At first, they were merely scribbles, misshapen circles, shaky lines, figures with missing limbs and eyes too wide. Yet there was something in their rawness that held our gaze. They looked alive, or rather on the edge of life. Over time, Yannick began using not just charcoal from the braziers, but also clay from the riverbanks and pigments extracted from walnut shells and dried herbs. His palette was poor, but his images were rich in unease. Each new figure carried a sense of foreboding, as if something was about to unfold. It was Brother Raphael, an old scholar of ailing manuscripts, who first noticed the pattern. On a misty morning, while observing fresh markings on the southern wall of the cloister, he noticed dark blotches on the faces Yannick had drawn. Oval shapes, shaded with strange, almost tender care. 3 days later, the convent's cook was taken by fever and swellings under the arms. And so it went. Day after day, what appeared on the walls began to manifest in flesh and fever among us. Some monks dismissed it as coincidence or fear twisting chance into suspicion, but for others, especially those who had witnessed the plague in nearby villages, Yannick's drawings were more than warnings. They were silent prophecy. In the refectory, conversation grew scarce, and whenever someone disappeared behind the infirmary curtain, eyes would turn discreetly to the cloister walls, as if consulting a dark calendar. It became hard to ignore that each line of charcoal seemed to know before we did. One afternoon, as the sun struggled to pierce the clouds and spill light on frozen stones, a new drawing appeared. It was the largest Yannick had ever done, covering nearly the entire wall near the old well. It showed a hunched figure, hands on knees, eyes wide with terror, blotches not only on the face, but also the belly and legs. Beside it, a winding line. Smoke or breath, perhaps. Around the scene, small circular marks like rats or moles. The entire convent fell silent that day. Even the bell tolled slower, as if it too sensed something nearing. Brother Gregor, the youngest among us, was the first to fall ill after that image appeared. Until then, he had been as strong as the walnut trees in the courtyard. But within the week, he began to sweat profusely, and his skin turned ashen, like the shadows Yannick used in his sketches. We watched helplessly as Gregor's body withered, following the mural step by step. And when the fever took him, only the morning's cold breeze and the heavy silence remained, the kind that arrives when one realizes even sacred stone offers no safety. For a time, the prior attempted to close off the cloister and erase the drawings. He ordered them scraped with lye and prayer, but each morning new images would appear, not in the same places, but with the same unsettling urgency. It was as if the charcoal obeyed only the hand of fate, and Yannick was merely its vessel. He did not resist the repression, nor hide. He sat before the walls, knees soiled, head gently tilted, drawing as if in prayer. And those who looked closely swore his eyes shone, not with fear, but with a strange serenity. As the months passed and winds carried word of entire villages silenced by plague, the convent became an island surrounded by absence. The world outside dissolved like ink in water. Monks stopped traveling. The visitor bells ceased, and even birds seemed to avoid our rooftops. Within our walls, however, Yannick continued to draw. It was as if the darkness outside fed his lines. Some monks began to see him as an oracle, others as a curse, but all, without exception, ceased to ignore him. I recall one night in particular, when a single candle flickered in the chapel and the snow whispered against stained glass. I found Yannick seated at the foot of a pillar, his fingers blackened with charcoal, his eyes lost in the dusk. I asked, though I knew no answer would come, "Do you see what hasn't happened yet?" He didn't move. He simply reached out his arm and pointed to the freshly drawn mural. It was a simple image, one hand laid gently atop another, a gesture of comfort. And that night, for the first time in weeks, there were no new fevers. The image remained untouched for days. No one dared erase it, and even the skeptics began kneeling before it in silence. There was something in that gesture, that hand over hand, that brought a strange peace, as if to say that despite the pain, tenderness was still possible. During that time, Yannick stopped drawing. Instead, he spent hours sitting beside the mural, his gaze fixed on the soft line of those fingers, as though listening to something we could not hear. The convent, at last, exhaled. For a brief moment, we breathed. But the truce did not last. A new outbreak arrived with a starving traveler we had taken into our kitchen. When he fell ill, Yannick disappeared for an entire day. We searched the barns, the cold corridors, even the stifled attic of the library. At dusk, we found him in the garden, hands buried in mud, mixing damp earth with bits of charcoal. He was creating a new ink, denser, darker. The next morning, a new mural covered the eastern wall, a boat laden with shadows, faceless figures crossing a black river. One brother murmured, "It's Charon, the ferryman of the dead." But Yannick, as always, said nothing. He simply gazed at his work, as if delivering a letter with no recipient. The days that followed were steeped in muted unrest. Every footstep echoed like an omen, and the bells, once steady, now hesitated in their tolls. Some brothers fasted in penance, others buried themselves in ancient texts, searching margins for forgotten answers. But all of us, without fail, passed at least once a day before the boat mural. It was impossible to avoid. There was something hypnotic about those drifting forms, as if their hollow silhouettes shifted at twilight, shaped by flickering candlelight. It was during this time that I noticed something curious. Though Yannick kept drawing, his strokes grew gentler, almost hesitant. No longer only illness and foreboding, but subtle, tender scenes. An old man handing bread to a boy, a veiled woman offering a rosary at a bedside, a dog lying at the feet of a sleeping monk. It was as if, amid the darkness, he sought seeds of light. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was his way of balancing the world, like a tightrope walker who, without words, held chaos 2 fingers from the abyss. Gradually, we came to trust his images as we trust the changing seasons. If Yannick drew something serene, we knew the days would be gentle. If instead his images darkened, the prior would call for fasting and prayer. One fog-laden morning, I found a parchment on the altar. Someone had written in a trembling hand, "Let the walls speak, for the boy's silence sees farther than our eyes." There was no signature, but no one doubted who had inspired those words. Then one dawn, as the snow fell without hurry, the convent woke to a different sound, a sharp scratching, like fingernails against stone. Descending to the cloister, the brothers found Yannick standing before the wall by the well where it all began. His hands were stained with ink, his eyes brighter than ever, and he was drawing a circle. Inside it, a figure, not ill, not hunched, but seated beneath a blooming tree, holding an open book. A spring scene. A rebirth. Around the boy, no shadows, no warnings, only peace. And when he finished, he dropped the charcoal to the floor, wiped his hands on his tunic, and smiled. For the first time. That smile, shy and crooked, was like the cracking of ice at winter's end. No one spoke. No one dared break the moment. Only the prior, with hands clasped at his chest, whispered a prayer, not of fear, but of gratitude. Yannick walked in silence to the refectory, sat beside the brother who gave him bread each morning, and remained there as if he finally belonged to time and place. The drawings did not stop, but they changed. No longer omens, but memories, hopes, small scenes of daily life, monks washing each other's feet, a sunflower growing between stones, children running under the sun. Months later, when the last patient was healed and the convent gates reopened to the world, Yannick was still mute, but no longer orphaned. He was ours. Visitors heard of the boy of images and came from afar to see the murals. Many knelt before them, not in fear, but in comfort. There was something miraculous in that silence, speaking through stone, and even as time, with its steady breeze, began to fade the oldest lines, no one restored the walls. We let them fade slowly, like memories softening in the heart, not as forgetting but as gentle longing. Years passed, and with them, Yannick's hair darkened before turning silver. He remained silent, but had learned to write small notes on bits of parchment tucked in his tunic. Sometimes he left messages on chapel benches, brief phrases like, "The wind is light today," or "The bees have returned to the garden." Little poems that, to the most attentive, spoke of more than weather. Even the eldest among us came to read his words as if they were letters from another time, a time only Yannick could still touch. When old age finally came for him, it did so without haste. Yannick walked slowly, but his gaze remained clear, the gaze of one who never carried the burden of speech. In the last spring he asked to be taken to the cloister. There he sat before the wall where he had drawn the boat of the dead so many years before. And with trembling hands he traced one final image, an open window with fluttering curtains, and beyond it the soft outline of a blooming hill. No figure, no omen, only a breeze drifting in, free as if to say, "It is time." That evening he fell asleep and departed, peacefully, without illness, without pain. As if silence had come for him once more, gentle as always. Since then, we have kept the cloister as a reliquary of wind and memory. We never sealed the wall, never painted over it. The stones, now worn, still hold traces of old lines. Faded strokes that time, with the patience of a washerwoman, has softened but not erased. Sometimes, when the evening light falls at just the right angle, we swear we see, just for a moment, Yannick's sunken eyes, his delicate hands, his calm gestures rising from the shadows, as if he never truly left. Visitors still come. They sit in silence, listen to the wind between the arches, and if they listen closely, they say they hear something more. The drag of charcoal on stone, the whisper of fingers shaping the invisible. And we, who still walk those cold corridors, carry his memory like a hymn without melody. For Yannick was not merely a mute, orphaned boy. He was a chronicler of a dark age, a gardener of hope between ailing walls, and a guardian of silence, a silence that never screamed, but always spoke. And on this quiet night, as you remember him, perhaps you too will hear, ever so softly, the sound of an image being drawn in the dark. And if one day you visit that convent, now resting among vineyards and ivy, like a forgotten book between the pages of the world, you might find, among the whispers of leaves and the creaks of old stone, the sense that time walks differently there, as if each footstep echoes not only through the corridors, but through memory. And as you pass by the mural of the open window, you might feel a breeze not from the field, but from somewhere more intimate, perhaps the heart. For there are stories that need no words to be told. They draw themselves across time, with strokes of tenderness and melancholy, and rest within us like a light blanket on a cold night. And now, as your eyes close gently, imagine yourself there, beneath the arches of the cloister, with the scent of damp stone and dried roses in the air, and the distant echo of a boy drawing dreams with clay and silence. Good night, traveler of memory. May Yannick watch over your dreams with the same gentleness with which he once covered ours. The Handless Bells, a ghostly song of the Black Plague. I remember a strange and silent time when the sky seemed greyer than usual, and even the sparrows hesitated before singing. It was in the region of Yorkshire during a particularly damp autumn when moss trickled down stone walls like green tears, and hearths burned day and night, not just for warmth, but from a kind of ancient fear hard to name. I was just a skinny boy, fatherless and son to a widowed seamstress, and we lived beside the small church of St. Mildred, whose stone tower rose above the fog like an old man's finger pointing toward heaven. Not a day went by without the bells of that tower ringing. Some said it was tradition, others said mourning. The sound of the bells was part of life, like the smell of morning bread or the murmur of water in the well. But in those days, it changed. It became slower, heavier, almost as if each toll carried the weight of a forgotten name. When the plague arrived, and it always arrived like a warm breeze at the end of the day, before anyone noticed, the bells continued to ring even when those of neighboring villages had fallen silent. In our village, few remained to pull the ropes. Old Edgar, who had tended the tower, fell ill first. Then Mrs. Brionia, who baked bread for the priests. And then, almost overnight, all that remained was the persistent echo of bells that seemed to toll by themselves. I remember the morning I first saw little Thomas with a rope tied around his waist, walking in circles across the stone floor of the church like a docile little lamb. The other end of the rope had been tied to the bell's ring, and with his short, steady steps, he made the bronze sing, though sorrowfully. It was an image both tender and haunting. A boy with hollow cheeks and eyes too big for his narrow face, pulling the bell's lament with the innocence of a game. Adults said it was an act of faith, that keeping the bell ringing would keep death at bay. But deep down, we knew it was only a way to pretend someone still remained to remember the ones who had gone. Over time, other children began to help. The younger ones, who still didn't fully understand what it meant to wear black clothes or why food came cold and without salt. Some carried dried apples in their pockets or wooden rosaries around their necks, perhaps for protection. A grey donkey, with gentle eyes and sleepy steps, was even trained to pull the ropes when the wind grew too strong for the children. It was almost comical to see him walking in slow circles around the tower, a rope hanging from his makeshift saddle. And yet, there was something profoundly sad in that continuous sound, as if the entire village refused to accept the final silence. Some claimed the bells rang even when no one pulled the ropes. One night, just before the first snow, I awoke to an irregular ringing, like metallic sobs. I went to the window and saw the tower motionless, dark as a tomb. No torches lit, no movement below, and still the sound persisted, slow, spaced out, as if the very stone were crying. The next day, no one spoke of it, perhaps for fear of sounding foolish, or because in times of plague, the strange becomes ordinary. But from that night on, I began to listen to the bells differently, like someone overhearing a confession. One foggy afternoon, I found old Maud sitting on the chapel steps, lulled by the tolling bells, as if it were a lullaby. She was one of the village's last elder women, known for her herbal infusions and stories from when the world had more laughter than mourning. When I asked if she didn't find it strange that the bells never stopped, she smiled gently and said, "They ring for us, even when we forget to cry. Sometimes the dead don't want silence, they just want to be remembered." Then she closed her eyes, as if listening to a melody I had yet to understand. In those long and empty days, the sound of the bells became part of the air, like the scent of smoke that never left our clothes, or the creak of wooden gates being shut before nightfall. Children learned to sleep to their sound, and the old sighed when they heard it, not in fear, but with calm acceptance, as if recognizing an ancient promise being fulfilled. Sometimes during Mass or the rare gatherings in the square, someone would remark that the sound seemed to come from farther away, as if the bells of other villages, even the abandoned ones, were answering ours. A collective lament, carried like wind over hills and valleys. I remember one dawn when I awoke with the strange sense that something had changed. I stepped barefoot to the door and was greeted by a silence so thick it felt like fog. The bell had stopped. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, no sound filled the sky. The tower still stood, imposing but mute, like a mouth that had said all it could. The silence, though expected, was nearly unbearable. And in that moment, I understood what I hadn't before. The sound wasn't just to mark deaths, it was to keep the fragile bonds between us alive. The next morning, the village seemed suspended in time. The roosters didn't crow, the children didn't run, and even the dogs dared not bark. Everyone seemed to listen to the emptiness, as if waiting for the bell to resume its sorrow. I walked to the church, across a field laced with thin frost, and found the donkey still tied to the post, eyes closed, breathing slow. Inside the tower, the rope lay coiled on the floor like a sleeping serpent. No one was there, not a footprint, not a single candle lit. Only the smell of old incense and an absent sound so present it felt almost touchable. That's when I noticed a small marking carved into the wooden door, a crooked cross with 3 dots beside it. It was the sign Maud used to make on her infusions to keep loneliness away, as she used to say. I stood there for a while, staring at that simple mark, until the sun began to filter through the stained glass windows of the nave. And in that soft golden light, I felt something like comfort. Perhaps silence, in the end, was a new kind of music, subtler, more inward, now ours to hear and preserve. In the days that followed, no one tried to ring the bell again. Some suggested resuming the ritual with animals or children, but something invisible seemed to whisper that the cycle had closed. It wasn't fear, it was reverence, as if the bells, in falling silent, had finally found rest. Even the children, always so eager to run and play, now passed quietly by the tower, looking up with a mix of reverence and longing. It was like visiting the grave of an old friend. You don't speak, but you feel their presence everywhere. What was most curious was that even with the bell quiet, many swore they still heard it at night, in the stillest hours. A soft sound, almost whispered, as if coming from the stones themselves or the breeze through the fields. They said it was the lament of those who had passed, or maybe the whisper of those who remained, trying not to forget. And so, without ceremony, the bell became part of us, not as an object, but as a living memory, an echo of the past that we learned to carry in our chest, like an invisible thread, linking the ones who left to those still waiting for spring. Sometimes, on the coldest nights, I would sit by the iron stove my mother always kept burning, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, listening to the fire crackle and the wind whistling through the window cracks. And it was in those moments that my mind would return to that silent tower, to little Thomas, to the patient donkey, to old Maud with her wise smile. It all felt as distant as a childhood dream, and yet as close as the warmth around my feet. Somehow, hard to explain, I felt that even in their absence, the bells were still watching over us. I grew up with that story as if it were my own, even as time took the last who had lived it. The village changed, new houses rose, names were replaced in the parish records, but the bell remained unmoving, high atop the tower, like a sleeping sentinel. And now and then, a traveler asks why it hasn't rung in years. I just smile and say that some sounds, once heard with the heart, never need to be repeated aloud. They live within us, like the memory of a warm embrace or a melody that once cradled our dreams. Today, as I look up at the pale winter sky and listen to the quiet world around me, I realize those bells taught me more than many men have tried to say in words. They taught me about presence, even in absence, about memory, even without record, and about the tenderness of what remains when everything else fades. There is deep comfort in knowing that something, no matter how simple, can pass through time simply because it was made with love, with hope, or with the sincere wish that pain would not go unnoticed. And so, I fall asleep many nights with the feeling that a distant bell still rings, not by hands nor by rope, but by memory, a sound only heard by those who once learned to listen to silence. May this memory, wrapped in mist and longing, keep you company tonight. May it bring the same comfort it brings to me, whenever the days feel too long and the nights too dense. For even in silence, the old tower's bells still sing within us. The Roses of Avignon, a silent garden over the Black Plague. I remember a distant spring, the kind where the wind smells of warm stone and damp earth, when I lived for a while in the hills that border Avignon. It was already the twilight of my youth, and I spent my days tending forgotten gardens, once kept by monks, and listening patiently to the stories of old widows in the region. The papal city still bore the weight of its silences then, and even the marble fountains seemed to whisper prayers for a bygone time. There was, however, a field no one dared name, a gentle rise covered in wild brush, where even birds seemed reluctant to land. The villagers called it Le Repos sans nom, the rest without name. It was said that during the darkest years of the Black Plague, when bells tolled endlessly and priests no longer had the strength to anoint the dead, many bodies were hurriedly buried there. No headstones, no prayers, no flowers, only open graves under the muffled sound of shovels and the fear of those who remained alive. I grew up hearing that to walk across that land was to risk having the spirits of the forgotten follow you home. And yet everyone knew the story of Mireille, the young woman who silently and under the veil of night visited the field with hands full of seeds and pockets heavy with small sticks marked with names. No one knew where she came from, nor where she lived. Only that she returned night after night, as if answering a call only she could hear. Some said she was mute, others that she had chosen silence as a form of penance. There were even those who swore they'd seen her speaking to the rose bushes before planting them, as if telling each one exactly where it should go. I myself only saw her once, and even then, from afar. She was a slender figure wrapped in a grey cloak, and her steps seemed not to disturb the tall grass. She knelt carefully, as if afraid of waking someone sleeping beneath the earth. And there, with slow, compassionate gestures, she opened the soil with bare hands, planted the seeds, and finally placed the small wooden stakes with names written in nearly faded ink. Then she would sit, motionless, for long minutes, as if listening to something no one else could hear. In time, the first rose bushes began to appear. Small at first, timid, pressed between dry branches and untouched soil. But soon others followed, in shades of white, tea blush, pale pink, some so fragrant that the breeze carried their scent all the way to the city's walls. People began to speak of it, not with fear, but with a quiet reverence, as if it were a blessing not to be disturbed. Some said the names on the stakes matched those of missing relatives, victims of the plague who never had a proper burial. And still, no one ever tried to approach Mireille. It was as if everyone understood instinctively that her ritual did not belong to them. Decades passed, and the roses kept blooming. Even when the soil cracked in the hardest summers, or when the winter frost made the ground hard as stone, they endured. It was as if, in that silent field, death itself had made peace with life. Children born long after the plague played among the flowering shrubs, unaware that beneath their feet slept men and women who had left the world without goodbyes. The mothers, upon noticing, simply smiled and asked for quiet, not out of fear, but respect. And thus that once cursed land became something like a garden of remembrance, where grief dressed itself in fragrance and color. It was on an April afternoon, many years later, that one of the nuns at the convent where I worked told me something I never forgot. She said that among the old belongings stored in the monastery, they had found a leather-bound notebook, its pages fragile and filled with names. Beside each name was a small note: brown hair, gentle smile, loved to sing at sunset, afraid of thunder. Nothing more, just fragments of humanity lost to time. And on the last page, written in trembling script, it read, "May each flower return a name to the silence." There was no signature, but everyone there knew who had written it. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about how many names are lost in the curves of time, how many full lives fade without leaving a trace, except in the hearts of those who refuse to forget. Mireille, with her soft gestures and reverent silence, had given these souls a place in the world once more, not with grand monuments or solemn speeches, but with flowers. Flowers that never asked who deserved to be remembered. They simply bloomed year after year in honor of what had once been love, fear, laughter, or pain. I began to visit the field more often after that, not out of duty, but from a desire to listen. I would sit among the now tall roses, lie on the soft grass, and remain there for hours, in silence. Sometimes the wind seemed to carry whispers, indistinct voices like leaves brushing one another. Other times, it was only the sweet, earthy scent of the flowers that enveloped me like a shawl. And there were days when I would swear someone sat beside me. Not a ghost, not a spirit, but the quiet presence of someone who knew they had not been forgotten. As years went by, the garden became known among travelers. Pilgrims who came to Avignon to pray in the old papal corridors often strayed off course, guided by whispered tales in local inns until they found that serene, blooming field. But no one ever picked a rose or crossed the moss-marked boundaries. It was as if everyone, upon arrival, instinctively understood they were stepping into sacred ground, not sanctified by clergy, but by the tenderness of one persistent human gesture. Many tried to uncover more about Mireille. They searched old records, cathedral archives, baptism books. Some claimed she had been the daughter of an apothecary. Others said she had lost her entire family to the plague before her 10th winter. There are those who believe she lived hidden in a monastery, under a false name, embroidering veils for novices in exchange for silence. But the truth is, no one ever knew for certain who she was, and perhaps that is the most beautiful part. She did not need to be remembered to remember others. She chose to be a bridge, not a statue. Once, at the end of a particularly mild summer, an old gardener who helped at the convent told me something curious. He said some rose bushes in the field seemed to have a life of their own. They grew in strange directions, circled stones as if protecting something, and some bloomed only on specific dates. There was one, in particular, that always blossomed on the night of November 1st, without fail, even in years of drought. It was white, so white it resembled freshly fallen snow, and its scent was nearly imperceptible. But those who caught it said it smelled like a mother's embrace. The gardener, superstitious as only the old can be, swore someone lay buried there who had never been named, but had been deeply loved. These stories stay with me to this day, like an old embroidery kept in the folds of memory. Whenever I catch the scent of roses in a public square, or see a child picking flowers without knowing why, I think of Mireille. I think of the softness of her steps, the silent sweetness of her gestures, and how she turned sorrow into beauty without ever asking for recognition. And when sadness visits me, as it sometimes does on long nights, I like to imagine that somewhere she still walks among the bushes with her pockets full of stakes and seeds, listening to voices no one else can hear. Now, looking back, I understand that some prayers need no words, and some memories bloom even where there was only silence. Mireille's garden, that once feared and forgotten field, became over time an open-air cathedral. There were no stained glass windows, no altars, only the sound of wind through petals and the rustling of dry leaves in autumn. There, every flower was a remembrance, every thorn a pain endured, every scent an old whisper of someone who once lived and loved, and, in their way, was loved in return. If you ever pass through Avignon, follow the soft hum of bees and the faded perfume in the air. You may find, among the roses, a small stick with a name handwritten, the name of someone you never knew, but whose existence echoes in every flower that defies time. And if you close your eyes for a moment, you may hear something too, not with your ears, but with that part of the heart that recognizes what is eternal. Because there are gardens not meant to be admired, but to be felt in silence, like an old embrace that still perfumes your dreams. The House of the Doves, 2 years of silence in the time of the Black Death. I remember a village hidden among the cold valleys of the Alps, where pine trees whispered ancient stories to the wind, and rooftops spent entire winters beneath a thick blanket of snow. In those days, the world seemed slower, as if the clocks themselves slept through the long nights. I was young, and the memory I now carry is not my own, but that of an old villager named Father Thomas, who once confided in me by the fireside about the house where time had stood still. It was a grey stone manor, with small windows and tall gates, perched high on a hillside, as if watching the village below with owl-like eyes. They said that within, a family had lived in silence through the darkest years of the Black Death. 2 full years without crossing the threshold. The old priest said that at first, the decision was met with suspicion. The villagers whispered that the Montclair family, wealthy merchants, were cursed or bewitched for refusing mutual aid in such desperate times. But the truth was something else. Something more fragile and deeply human. Fear. A fear as thick as fog, creeping in through the window cracks and clinging to the curtains. To protect themselves, they boarded up the doors with thick planks and lived like ghosts inside their own home. What intrigued the villagers most, however, was what they kept with them. Dozens of grey doves, caged in every room, perched like miniature sentinels. They believed the birds absorbed the miasmas, the invisible vapors said to carry the plague through the air. And so, day after day, they lived among feathers, sighs, and a silence that felt almost sacred. As the seasons turned, the Montclair house became more than just a residence. It became a living legend, observed from afar with a mixture of fear and fascination. In winter, the snow blanketed the roof and quieted the world, but within those walls, there was always the faint flutter of wings. There was no laughter, no songs, no footsteps, only the soft rustle of feathers, the occasional creak of a cage, and the distant ticking of a clock that no longer kept time for the outside world. The windows were sealed with damp cloths soaked in vinegar, and the hearths were lit with bundles of aromatic herbs in an effort to cleanse the air. The few servants slept in shifts to keep the embers alive, while the masters of the house wandered from room to room, whispering prayers and feeding the birds with crumbs of dry bread. The youngest daughter, Madeleine, was said to write diaries and burn them in the fireplace, as if she feared even words might carry disease. They said she spoke to the doves, and would sometimes release them to fly briefly through the high, shadowed great hall, where tapestries hung like silent old sermons. The sound of wings echoing through columns and stained glass was said to calm the household. Like a song with no notes, the Montclairs lived as if the world beyond had ceased to exist, and their only companions were the keen eyes of the birds and the murmurs of their own thoughts. And so the days passed, one after another, still and identical, like pages from a forgotten calendar. According to Father Thomas, there was one room on the upper floor where no one slept. It was lined with white sheets and lit by oil lamps that were never extinguished. There they kept the frailest doves, the ones that trembled, the ones that seemed to have absorbed too much of the sickened world they had never seen. They called them the Sentinels, and treated them with reverence, as if they were silent monks keeping vigil. Sometimes Madeleine tied little notes to their legs, even knowing they would never fly beyond those walls. A useless gesture, perhaps, but one filled with hope, or what remains when hope itself falls silent and becomes ritual. Their days were marked not by clocks, but by the behavior of the birds. If a dove stopped singing, it was a day for silence. If they flew in circles, they believed danger was near. If they perched early at dusk, the family would follow suit and retire sooner. Over time, the family began to behave like the birds themselves, speaking softly, eating slowly, walking lightly, as if afraid to disturb something invisible. Their clothing grew simpler, their voices quieter, and laughter, disappeared so gradually that no one noticed its absence. The Montclair house had become a home of silence, of shadow, and of wings. Then came the spring of the second year, with its humid winds and scent of new earth. It is said that during that season, the father, Monsieur Etienne Montclair, climbed to the attic at dawn, and without saying a word, opened one of the windows for the first time in many months. Fresh air entered like an old guest, timid, yet persistent. Some doves flew out immediately, frantically beating their wings, as if they couldn't believe in freedom. Others hesitated, wary of the light. Downstairs, the children awoke to the sound, and for a moment thought they were dreaming. The house, once so quiet, now pulsed with a strange new life, as if time had returned to resume its forgotten course. That same week, the doors were unlocked. There was no ceremony, no announcement, just a slow creaking, like a tree bending in the wind. When the villagers saw the Montclairs step onto the threshold, they barely recognized them. Hair, once dark, had turned white or silver. Their eyes, once proud and bright, now looked inward, as if they had learned to see differently. They walked slowly, hands folded one over the other, like monks in procession. And behind them, a dove or two still followed, perching on shoulders or windowsills. No one spoke. No one dared to laugh or cry. There was only a reverent silence, as if witnessing a miracle or a mourning that had lasted too long. In the village, rumors sprang up at once. Some said they'd made a pact, others that they had died and returned. But Father Thomas, who received them at the church days later, said he had never seen eyes so full of life and sorrow. There was something about the Montclairs that felt beyond time. They no longer feared the plague, nor death, nor solitude. They lived with a calmness that unsettled the young and quieted the old. Madeleine, now with distant eyes and hair like snow across her shoulders, did not speak. She only listened, and when asked what she heard, she whispered, "Wings," as if the sound was still there, within the walls of her mind, the soft, constant flutter of wings inside a dream that never ended. As the months passed, they resumed a quiet routine. The Montclairs did not rebuild feasts, did not host guests, nor did they resume selling fabrics and spices. They simply walked through the village, sat beneath trees, gazed at the sky. Sometimes they were seen scattering grain on windowsills, waiting for winged visitors who did not always come. It was said they kept an empty cage by the door, always open, as if expecting someone's return. Slowly, they became part of the landscape, like the church bell or the mist that rolled down from the hills. And though many did not understand, no one dared to laugh anymore. There was something sacred in their silence, as if it had learned to tell stories words could never hold. Years later, when the priest's children were old enough not to fear ghosts, they climbed the hill to the old Montclair house, now empty, its windows cracked with time. Inside, everything remained strangely untouched, as if the days themselves had lain down there and fallen asleep. The cages still hung, some with grey feathers nestled at the bottom, like remnants of an ancient vigil. In the bedrooms, linen curtains shrouded the light like mourning veils, and in the great central hall, a single bench faced a half-open window before which lay a clay bowl filled with dried grains. It was as if they were still waiting. As if, somewhere in the house, someone still believed time would return by way of the wind. No one ever truly knew what had protected them. whether it was isolation, luck, or the doves themselves. But in that alpine village, even now, some say the Montclairs survived not out of fear, but from silent devotion to something unseen. A nameless faith, expressed in the care of birds, in listening to silence, and in the quiet courage of staying. Their story passed from mouth to mouth, reshaped by the years. Some say lights once danced in the windows at night, others that Madeleine was carried off by a white bird on a misty day. But most remember only the stillness, the way the Montclairs walked slowly, with eyes that had seen the world in silence, and still chose to love it gently. Today, when I pass near that hillside, now blanketed in moss and wildflowers, where the Montclair house once watched over the village, I like to believe the silence that remains is not emptiness, but memory. The sound of wings that Madeleine once heard may still be there, not in the ears, but in the heart of anyone who has learned to hear what the world lets slip away. Sometimes I sit on a nearby stone, close my eyes, and let the wind tell me stories. There's a strange peace in that breeze, as if it carries old secrets in its folds. And deep down, I believe we all have our inner doves, those small, silent hopes that protect us from what we cannot understand, that keep us gentle and remind us that even in fear there is beauty. And so I take my leave of you on this quiet night, with the memory of that family who chose silence, but not forgetfulness, who learned to live lightly, even among shadows, who remind us that there are ways of surviving not measured in words, but in gestures, like feeding a bird, opening a window, or simply waiting. May the sound of wings accompany your rest tonight, soft and watchful. May the silence that surrounds your sleep be as full of meaning as the one that once guarded the Montclair house. Good night, and until our next journey through the memories time nearly forgot, but the heart never did.